This is episode 488 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Sine die.
Sine die. Gone for another year, unless there's a special session, which I think the chances of that are higher than we think.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, although, as we will discuss momentarily, at least some of the priorities, or one of the priorities that I think everybody had for the session did wind up getting passed in crazy fashion. You know, we were talking a week ago, and it didn't look like medical malpractice reform was going to happen. And then I believe very strongly that the governor got the Democrats in the legislature behind closed doors and gave them a little talking to, and sure enough, that resulted in medical malpractice reform. But we're going to start this conversation on the gross receipts tax side of things and kind of the overall appraisal of the session. Before we hit this session, I shared with you and listeners to the show that there were three big priorities that the Rio Grande Foundation had. Education reform, and that could have taken different forms. Restoration of legislative control over emergencies, or at least a seat at the table, and elimination of pyramiding of the gross receipts tax on business services and business inputs. Unfortunately, 0 for 3, that means we struck out.
Yes.
Of course, we're dealing with a progressive group in Santa Fe. They're also blessed with more money than they knew what to do with, $3.6 billion surplus, and really was holding out hope for GRT reform, but never included in any of the omnibus tax bills. And there was a lot of stuff pinging back and forth on those tax bills, but ultimately, based on those three priorities striking out, you got to say this is a failed legislative session.
Yeah, Paul, they had a lot more money than they had a vision or, political will on almost on anything. It is really interesting to me. Even if you look at, there wasn't a lot of unification, even on highly partisan progressive things. They didn't make a lot of progress. So, I mean, if you're the ultimate progressive and you think every progressive initiative is good, they didn't make much progress on that. They just kind of skated by. They did the bare minimum. The status quo really won out in most cases, and just a bare modicum of gross receipts tax reform. And it is interesting, although, but if we ever need that money, it will go back up. It's interesting how that's always the case when they reduce taxes, but they never do that when it goes the other way, when they raise a tax and say, if we collect too much money, we're going to take it down the other direction. But all in all, very disappointing. Crime, a big snoozer, nothing, really nothing on crime, nothing on education, as you said. As little as could possibly be done on healthcare, but I think, Paul, that was that's just the ante into New Mexico's lack of healthcare provider problems, and that's one of the things I think could bring a special session here in New Mexico. And if that wouldn't have done the reforming against the will of the trial attorneys for malpractice, I think they'd be up there for sure. And I don't think the governor wants that, because she wants to just skate through and see what happens here in January of 2024.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you. So tax bill, this is one where you need the history to really fully appreciate this thing. So it started out as a cruel joke in the House where you had the income tax rates going up, you had the corporate taxes going up. You had capital gains tax going up. You had significant tax increases on alcohol and tobacco, but you did have a half a cent reduction in the GRT kicking in immediately. No reform of the GRT. That bill was improved markedly by the time it got passed through the House. The personal income tax increases were pulled out. There were reductions in the aggressiveness of the alcohol and tobacco tax increases. The Senate went in and made the tax bill generally somewhat worse, restoring the increase in taxes on alcohol. They did tie the Social Security tax exemption passed last year to inflation, poured in some more corporate welfare, including film subsidies. And, back and forth they went with concurrences. And ultimately, we wind up with a bill that passed with much more generous film subsidies. The gross receipts tax reduction, such as it is, doesn't take effect for 4 years, phased in. And if revenues drop below 95% of top year revenues, then we see those tax rates go back up. So it's not even baked in that we're going to see that tax reduction. So more uncertainty for businesses. Then one good thing happened, which is deductibles and copays suddenly were eliminated from taxation on medical appointments. So that's good. But overall, the bill that passed and is going to the governor for maybe signing, I still would be not surprised if she line item vetoed some of the worst provisions out of that, simply because she doesn't want to see so many taxes going up with her party in the majority and dealing with that kind of budget surplus. I think she might have some heartburn about raising some of those taxes. And finally, I'll just say that this really highlights the session and its ineptitude. Representative Christine Chandler, who at one time before the committee, before the session, was the chair of House Tax and Revenue. She pointed out, this is from an email sent by the Albuquerque Chamber, that delaying the full implementation of the gross receipts tax rate reductions for 4 years was necessary, in her opinion, in order to pay for the film tax credits. So you're postponing and making more tenuous pretty much the best tax reform outside of the actual pyramiding issue. And instead, you're handing over even more money to Hollywood. Now, under this law, some films in the state of New Mexico can get 40 cents on the dollar from the taxpayers of the state of New Mexico for filming here. And you also have increased caps across the board on actual individual productions, as well as the overall spend. I mean, and that came kind of out of nowhere after the first House version was passed through the House and moved on to the Senate. It's just awful policy and a lot of different things. And we're going to have at Errors of Enchantment multiple posts about that tax bill before we even get on to how the overall session went, because the tax bill really, I think, defined the session. And it's a conflict, as you said. Progressives didn't even have a sound set of priorities from the progressive perspective. There are, film subsidies are the least progressive policy you can imagine. And there's a variety of other anti-progressive policies, taxes on tobacco, taxes on alcohol, etc., all kinds of stuff. They didn't even have their stuff together. So what you have is a sewn together Frankenstein of a bill that doesn't really achieve progressive or Democrat priorities, and certainly doesn't achieve Republican priorities or anything real positive for the state of New Mexico economically moving forward.
The way I think about it is, I said I think there's a lack of vision, a lack of will, a lack of a solid plan for what needed to be done with the money. But you know, money is fine, money's great, but if you have a lot of money in the hands of a government, there usually isn't enough. That money doesn't carry enough power to overdo bad policy in and of itself, and so I guess the thing I should be thankful for, Paul, is that there's not a lot of bad policy because there wasn't a much policy at all, But if you're in Hollywood, those poor Hollywood producers, they now will keep coming to New Mexico. That seems film and marijuana are our diversification strategy in New Mexico for our economy, and I'm not sure either one of them is necessarily up to the challenge. And especially if you think that the oil and gas industry will ever take a dip, in the foreseeable future, which I think it'll be here for decades, if not centuries, as a big part of the New Mexico economy. But it's likely to take a dip. You get a recession, heaven forbid peace breaks out in the world, and you could see a lot lower prices of oil, and you could see a lot less money flowing into New Mexico. And then the other issue on top of that is what we raise kind of so-called ongoing or permanent spending. 14% was the number I saw. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's the thing: if we get a lot less revenue in the not too distant future, guess what? What are we going to raise taxes more during a recession when the economy's down? Are we going to cut spending? That doesn't seem to be any legislative body's strong suit. So yeah, there is much to be disappointed in. And guess what? At the rate we're going, we're going to get to do it again this next year. Maybe there will be something with a little more focus on the things that maybe, in my opinion anyway, make the most difference in people's day-to-day lives. Crime, educating our children, diversifying our economy. And then I've added the fourth one, and that really boils down to healthcare. If you can't see a doctor, it doesn't matter what your quote insurance card says.
Yeah. So just a brutal and massive disappointment. Now, on the tax bill front, one of the problems and challenges we focused on is that when the majority party, Democrats in this case, don't have their bleep together, they mishandle things. They pass bad anti-growth, anti-business policies that they should be penalized, and that this should be pointed out by the opposition. I think that opposition needs to have a coherent strategy. Now, they need a coherent strategy going into the legislative session, and we haven't necessarily seen that. But what is the opposition perspective on what happened this session? I wish I could create a little chip or had some kind of shortwave or longwave radio mechanism that I could reach directly into their brains and say, this is the messaging that you all need to have and that you all need to share. Jason Harper, kind of the guru of taxes on the Republican side, said, "Oh, everybody's going to get a tax cut under this." Well, maybe not. People who are selling stocks and selling businesses after having seen them appreciate and experiencing what are called capital gains, they could easily see significant tax increases. The gross receipts tax reduction, like I said, that is very perilous now at this point because it depends on the oil industry continuing to boom in New Mexico. We are at absolute record revenue levels, and if things go down at some point, they could really mess with those tax reductions. And just the fact that there was such a major surplus. I mean, yes, you're not going to get everything you want, even in a $3.6 billion budget surplus situation. But there is nothing in the legislation that or passed during this session that is going to have a positive impact on New Mexico's economy. And Republicans and any opposition movement should have their own plan. Here is what we plan to do with those dollars. And I really wish and hope and am going to be more vocal about the perspective that this needs to be done, or New Mexico is going to continue on its current path with, as the profligate, the biblical story of the not the profligate
the
son,
talons.
the son who goes out and takes his dad's inheritance or half of it and goes and blows it all. Profligate and prodigal. I think they're connected somewhere.
Okay, got it.
Prodigal son who goes out and blows all the money. New Mexico's pretty much the prodigal son, maybe not spending it on the alcohol and women, so to speak, but wasting on Hollywood subsidies is the I think financial equivalent of doing that kind of wasteful activity. So it's we really need some people in the know in political positions of power to agree on an alternative path forward for New Mexico, because the way things are going now, we're going to come to the end of a 5, 10, whatever year cycle of record revenues, and New Mexico's still going to be 50th or 51st in darn near everything, and that's just it's depressing.
I agree with you, Paul. Yes, policy over the currency is what we need here in New Mexico, and yeah, we didn't see that, and hopefully we'll get our act together before it goes the other direction, because heaven forbid, like I say, the worst case scenario is to have the bottom fall out of the oil and gas industry, and then we'll be raising taxes, because heaven forbid we should cut spending at the state government level, even though here in New Mexico we spend a lot more of a percentage of our income than the surrounding states, Arizona, Colorado, and Texas being a few of those.
Yeah, now definitely want to talk in a little more detail about spending, but I don't want everybody jumping off rooftops either. There were some decent things that happened, and most notably with regard to the medical malpractice issue. A week ago, we were saying that didn't look like the Democrats had it in them to do anything about the medical malpractice, that the legislature had clearly, on the Democrat side, been, kind of beholden to the trial attorneys, and that they weren't going to budge. Well, suddenly, I think the governor got them all in a room and said, we're going to do this, and you're not going to say no. And the tune changed very quickly. A dummy bill was commandeered that included a $1 million cap on the clinics not affiliated with hospitals that were soon to be exposed to the $5 million cap, up from $750,000, but not, in the grand scheme of things, $1 million from $750,000. There's always inflation and et cetera. So it was a relatively, definitely a solution to the problem. And thing went through very, very quickly. It's a self-created problem from just a few years ago. So this is not, a policy reform that is going to somehow move waves through the state as a extremely positive economic reform. But the process of chasing out doctors, nurses, and other medical professors has at least, we've stopped the bleeding in some big ways, at least temporarily.
Yeah, and the way I think about this is that we were healthcare providers are tough to come by across the country, and we had things that made it worse in New Mexico, and many of those things still make it worse in New Mexico. Our high reliance on Medicaid, gross receipts tax, and then this was going to be just a huge shock to a trend that was already going negative. So, I do think it was a good thing they addressed that, but I have a feeling we might need to do a little more as a state if we're going to be anything approaching a first world healthcare system, because we're certainly drifting in the other direction.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Obviously, people in the medical community who may have had one foot out the door or been looking to move away from New Mexico for whatever reason, including the malpractice issue or some other financial concern, they may have already made that decision. It's one of those things that you pass bad policy, period, and it does come back to you. Hopefully, this particular legislation, along with the gross receipts tax elimination on deductibles and copays, will do what they need to do. But I obviously think that spurring long-term economic growth, anybody wants to be in a state that is economically successful and is growing and prosperous relative to a state that is bought into the poverty mindset and continues to bounce along in a high poverty environment. You want a crime problem, especially if you're in Albuquerque, to be addressed. You want the education system to be addressed. And of course, the Medicaid issue itself drives a lot of problems within the medical profession. Just those payments are not the same, not enough. And with 47% of our population on some kind of Medicaid, that is unsustainable and not healthy for the state. And the fact that HB 400, a bill passed to originally, it had a provision that would have expanded Medicaid even further eligibility, so higher income levels. It was transitioned to a study, so not nearly as harmful. But the idea that New Mexico is even considering expanding Medicaid when already nearly half the population is on that program is just, it's mind-blowing.
It really is. And, the Medicaid is a little bit like inflation. At low levels, it's not that bad and you can adjust, but when it gets up there, things start to happen to the system. And that's where we've gotten to at New Mexico. We're number one, is that correct, Paul? The highest percentage of Medicaid
Yes.
people in the country. So we're number one on that. So I have a feeling that it would be interesting to look at the correlation between high Medicaid and high poverty levels. But the two are related. Although you got to be careful with statistics about what's causing what. But those two are not good. And then the other thing is we look at healthcare providers. It's tougher to get people to move, period, right now in our economy, because guess what? Mortgage rates are 6 or 7%. And if you're in another state and you're going to come to New Mexico, you might have to give up your 2 or 3% mortgage to buy your house here in New Mexico at a 6 or 7% mortgage. And believe me, doctors make enough money that they want to buy houses most of the cases. Just little things like that really place New Mexico at a further disadvantage because things were going poorly anyway. And so you look at what's going on out there, people are not moving around as much, period. And guess what? If we were on top of the healthcare, meaning we had more healthcare providers per capita than anyone, that would work to our advantage. Because we're on the other side, that works to our disadvantage as a state.
Yeah, and real quickly on that Medicaid issue, the 47% figure is from none other than the state's Legislative Finance Committee, which is kind of the legislature's, remember, Democrat legislature's internal think tank. That's something that they had put forth back in December. If you go to the Kaiser Family Foundation and you can find a map of Medicaid dependency by state. The number for New Mexico that they present is much lower, 34%, but it is number one. The number two state is Louisiana at 32%, and it goes down from there. So we are number one for sure in Medicaid dependency. And whatever that final number is, it is very, very high relative to other U.S. states. And that's definitely one of the problems that we face here in New Mexico. Keeping doctors around just needs to be addressed, and I see no impetus for the current legislature to do anything significant about that. And you mentioned the budget increase, 14% in a single year, and that's been going up dramatically as we've seen the surplus. That number was originally going to be 12% this session, and they decided, well,
What's 2% amongst friends with a big surplus?
That's certainly something that they can easily do with the lack of accountability. But I think in summary, these are the two that wind up being the dominant issues: is the tax bill and medical malpractice bill. We've talked about them a lot. There are a lot of other bills that were considered. Thankfully, many of them fell by the wayside. But if you are looking at New Mexico from an outsider's perspective, it doesn't matter if you're a medical professional or a business owner, with $3.6 billion to play with, the New Mexico legislature did not do anything to move the needle in a positive direction for New Mexicans as a whole. To bring new businesses here, you're not suddenly saying, gosh, look, New Mexico's serious about developing its economy. It's serious about making itself more attractive. No, you're not doing the fundamental change to the GRT that needs to be done, and you're not even implementing a cut right away. You're making it contingent on 4 years passing and the budget remaining at a very high level. It just, you look at it and you say, this was a terrible missed opportunity. Now, you would hope that voters would be of the same mindset, but again, they've got to have that case made to them by members of the opposition, and we'll see where that goes. But we talked about the three things coming into the session. Of course, electricity shortage, really not included. Whether the utilities, P&M especially, have the juice to keep the air conditioning on and the lights on in May and June when it does heat up around here. That is something that is, they've said numerous times very publicly that they're concerned about. The legislature seemed very unconcerned about it. That's not going to help do anything. If you're a medical professional looking to come here, considering leaving, if you're a business owner, whatever it may be, you're not excited about that. Now, of course, the rubber only hits the road if the lights go out, and nobody's cheering for that. But it's something that has to be concerning to anybody in New Mexico. It's just it's the kind of thing that people will only figure out when it hits them and the lights are flashing off, or when the air conditioning goes off.
Yeah, and then in addition to that reliability issue, which is a big issue, and Paul, we talk from time to time, not flippantly, but somewhat tongue-in-cheek about generator purchases. I've moved much beyond that to where I believe I know the one I'm going to be buying. So, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But in addition to that, we also have the pricing things happening. We're shutting down coal plants very quickly. More and more, the only reliable fuel source is natural gas. And we saw in January huge price increases in natural gas that impacted not only those that use natural gas as a fuel source through New Mexico Gas Company and other utilities, but also is having an impact on the utilities around the state that use natural gas to power their power plants. So there's much to happen with that regard. So this will be the summer of uncertainty, I'm going to call it. What will prices be? How much will they go up for natural gas, for electricity? And then, the cliffhanger before we go to a soap opera, to a soap commercial is, and will P&M get their deal done with Avangrid, their merger done, and what will that mean for the state? So there's a lot going on with that, but at this point, I don't think that's necessarily crept into the mind of the average person on the street very highly. But if the lights go out enough, or the prices go up enough quickly, I think that could change very quickly as well. But what did the legislature do about that? Not a thing.
Not a thing.
They didn't even talk about it. So
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we consider our role at the Rio Grande Foundation. And I understand the media has changed. The minority party, minority viewpoint does not have a lot of friends in the state media. But when you are given a microphone, when you are able to talk and be quoted about these things in the paper and whatnot, it would be good strategy to have your talking points unified and all on the same page internal to your party. Kind of the old line, I believe it was Ben Franklin during the Revolution said, we'll all hang together or hang separately. And right now, they're hanging separately. Let's see. In terms of other things, the voting rights bill, the voting expansion, voting accountability, repeal, HB4 passed, automatic voter registration at the MVD and government agencies, mandatory drop box, felons voting before their time was completely served, permanent absentee voting. That's definitely a concern and a problem. I think that it is going to make voter fraud a more likely occurrence and make it somewhat more difficult on the margins for Republicans to win elections. Not that it's been easy for them, but it's definitely a problem in a state that can be described, I think, at this point as deep blue. So HB4. On the other hand, paid leave died in a bit of a miracle. SB 11, net zero died. Clean fuel standard died. Plastic bag ban died. No minimum wage increase is going to happen. So I'm interested in your thoughts here, Wally. I'm not surprised that not all of those passed, but I am surprised that all of them failed. I just thought, and I know maybe I have too high of a respect for the strategic thinking. Even if I completely disagree with them about what they're trying to do, you would think that, like the governor with the medical malpractice issue, that she said, this is what I want. Well, you would think that somebody in Santa Fe with the stature, Senate Majority Leader Worth or Javier Martinez, could say, this is what we want to focus on this session. This is the bill, or these are the bills that we want to really get passed. And they clearly did that on the voting bill and the transgender / abortion bill, because they think that social agenda. Now, I think they're right on abortion. I think they are able to beat that dead horse repeatedly to gin up support among their constituencies. They just mention abortion and it seems to multiply their vote totals. But on the economic side of things, they really did not seem to, the Democrats that is, to have a organizing principle on what they really wanted to get done and what they didn't care so much about.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Paul, and I do not know the reason for that. I'm going to offer an item of speculation. It's possible that there is some kind of public policy polling information, either nationwide or in more particular the state of New Mexico, that shows that people with inflation are starting to question the Democrats' handling of the economy, and some of these issues, they're starting to definitely feel it at the grocery store and other things, so that maybe that was why there wasn't as much just progressive verve and vigor in getting some things done that they certainly had the votes to do if they wanted to with such very large majorities in both houses. Plastic bag ban, it's one of those they've loved that. But I mean, like I say, is there polling where people are saying, "Hey, we've done it with and without, and we think plastic bag ban is stupid"? I don't know. Like I say, do you want to? What's the more likely in something like that? Is it poor legislative strategy by the Democrats, or is there something else? I don't know. It's always absent information the contrary. You would always want to guess. I would always guess disorganization, but to not get a lot of these things done, I'm not sure why they didn't. Don't get me wrong. I'm happy they did. I think it's a very good thing for the state. I think it helps us in ways, particularly some of their just crazy failed environmental schemes probably kept us, speaking of things that would keep the lights on and keep from being impoverished from an energy point of view. Some of the things they had proposed died. I think they should have died, but the fact that they did was good news. And I guess I will quit looking further and just hope in the interim that will be something that will continue here in our state.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that no radical environmental policies were passed. I mean, not a lot of policies, but when it comes to the tax bill, giveaways were included for storage of energy, electricity, tax breaks for electric vehicles and their charging stations. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, not really super significant. I mean, bad policy to be absolutely clear, but nothing that really, when you're talking about the vision that the radical environmental progressives have,
net zero 2040 or net zero
Yeah.
2050. Something that is crazy and not going to happen. And the countries that get the furthest along with that are going to be the ones that crash the hardest, by the way. You know what I mean? So the International Energy Agency has their net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. I'd highly recommend it to anybody to read. The gyrations that would be needed to get there on a worldwide basis, much less the state of New Mexico, much less the U.S., are crazy. And if carbon emissions are important to you, that doesn't mean we don't need to work on them. But believe me, there are things in there that would be beyond any impact that any war could have. So,
and I think the upshot here, longer term, is that we have a very progressive legislature right now by any standard. No, we're not California, but that's partially a cultural thing. California, by definition of its cultural hegemony, its massive population, is always going to be a quote unquote leader, even if it's the stupidest idea out there. They're going to lead the way. New Mexico's just not going to, for a variety of reasons. I think the longer term question is, do the radical environmental groups and their kind of fundraising people, how much money are you going to continue to pour into the state of New Mexico so that you can get more EV tax credits and that kind of thing? It just strikes me as we may have hit like a ceiling of progressive policy here in New Mexico. There's obviously ways that the state can move back towards a more conservative, more common sense from our perspective, viewpoints in the world of public policy. But we're clearly not at this point in time going to go further and further down the tracks. As I see it, the oil and gas industry is just too integral a part of the state's economy for us to go completely off the deep end. And I guess one of the policies on the environmental front that did kind of go towards the deep end is the attempt to prevent Holtec from engaging in nuclear storage in southeast New Mexico, potentially millions, billion maybe investments, depending on how that thing planned out, thousands of jobs, construction. If this was a Hollywood studio being set up with our tax dollars, the left would be thrilled and talking about how great it was. Instead, a bill passed through both houses. And again, I haven't caught up on the signing situation, but the Holtec issue, the governor opposes having that plant in southeast New Mexico. I mean, is that really
Well, and
radical environmental policy or NIMBY? I think it's much more NIMBY.
And is that even going to be effective? Is it just a futile gesture by the state? That's the other important issue. And, you know, it reminds me of Paula's, was there an anti-fracking bill this time? Did I miss it? Because there were always...
No, I think Antoinette Cedillo Lopez gave up the ghost on that one, at least this session.
But here's the thing is when they have no chance of passing something, bills like that are a lot easier to do. You know, the whole tech thing might be a lot easier to do if it's going to have no impact on anything anyway. If you have both branches of the legislature and the governorship, and you do an anti-fracking bill, you know, you will get people's attention. You know what I mean? In terms of a place to go. So I don't know. Maybe there's an element of that where, you know, they are so solidly there, even an anti-fracking bill is viewed as something that, you know, why do that? We're not going to pass that. It's crazy. But what do they call that? Virtue signaling. So maybe we've had enough of that in New Mexico.
Yeah. Well, more to come. We'll be keeping track of the governor's signing and vetoing. I still suspect that there's going to be that we haven't got a finalized tax bill. I think there's going to be some changes to that. And maybe the governor will signal whether she's going to bring them back at some point to deal with the gun issue or something on medical malpractice. But a 30-day session, not a successful one, doesn't do anything that needs to be done. And maybe that is something that we can credit to internal fractions among the Democrats, even with the progressive hegemony in the state of New Mexico. The progressives really could, if they were united, enact darn near whatever they wanted, and they still, thankfully, cannot quite do that. So quite a session. We're glad it's in the books. We'll talk more about the Freedom Index scores and go through those completely. They're not quite finalized yet. We're working on some concurrences, trying to get those wrapped up, but you can go to riograndefoundation.org to find basically close to final vote scores for each legislator at the Freedom Index, the vote tracking mechanism that we've been doing throughout the session. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.